The holy Baal Shem Tov, the Heilige Baal Shem Tov, met a great scholar who was an incredible Talmud Chacham, very learned man, but not sensitive to what we would call the neshama, the soul dimension of the Torah, the godliness, the God dimension of the Torah, strictly the intellectual dimension. And the Baal Shem Tov was trying to impress upon this person how important it is to join together the two dimensions of Torah, the revealed Torah and the secret Torah. What in our lesson is called the Torah that is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the Torah that is the tree of life. And he could make no impression on this man. So the Baal Shem Tov said to him, Tell me some of your teachings. Tell me some of your creative ideas, your original thoughts on Torah. So he told the Heilige Baal Shem Tov some of the innovations he'd made recently, some of the Hakodesh Torah he'd made, and the Baal Shem Tov asked him a question that he couldn't resolve. And he oohed and ahed. He said to the Baal Shem Tov, "You stumped me, I don't have any resolution." The Baal Shem Tov then proceeded to explain to him, to answer the question he had asked, removing the question the Baal Shem Tov himself had raised. Now this person had been so thoroughly convinced of the Baal Shem Tov's refutation, of Baal Shem Tov's question, that now that the Baal Shem Tov was in defense of his original teaching, he found himself in argument with the Baal Shem Tov, trying to defend the Baal Shem Tov's question of his original hypothesis, original theory, until the Baal Shem Tov convinced him that no, the answer was good. And as soon as the man was convinced that the original teaching he had said was correct based on the answer to the question the Baal Shem Tov had asked him, the Baal Shem Tov asked him a second question. And this whole story repeated itself again. They had another argument until the Baal Shem Tov showed him that there was no resolution, that the question was irrefutable, that he was wrong. And once he was convinced he was wrong, the Baal Shem Tov all over again showed him that the answer that he had given to him was correct, and the refutation to the answer to the refutation to the original hypothesis was correct. A few times, back and forth, until the man was dizzy. Here he was, a great scholar, and he found himself arguing against himself to defend he wasn't sure whom. Until it was obvious that the Baal Shem Tov was playing a game with him. Baal Shem Tov was trying to show him something. So he says, okay, let's not play anymore. What's the message? And the Baal Shem Tov told him something wonderful. There's actually a maimer from the Alter Rebbe in the Maimar HaKetzorim which is based on this story. The Baal Shem Tov explained to this person, every answer in Torah can be questioned, every question in Torah can be answered, and every answer can be further refuted. Because Torah exists in every world. And what is solid, what is sufficient, what is complete in one world is problematic in another world. And what is a resolution in that higher world is problematic in a world higher than that, higher and higher and higher still. And in theory, it's ad infinitum, it goes on forever. The exception is when you identify the godliness of the Torah. So long as you're focusing on the intellectual dimensions of the Torah, every answer has a question, every question has an answer. But the idea that, as the Gemara says, the Talmud says, Anochi anon nafshi ksavis yahavis, God Almighty says, I wrote myself into my book. That's constant. That's absolute. That can't be questioned, and that doesn't need resolution. That's absolute. And this idea that I've just shared with you is something which is quite important in the philosophy and teachings of Hasidus. And it is, to be sure, one of the Rebbe's pet peeves, one of the Rebbe's favorite ideas. One of the things that Rebbe gets a special delight from is what he would call Achdos in Torah, the unity within Torah, to show the Torah Achas V'Kolana, that the Torah is one. Torah has many layers. Pshat, Remez, Drush, Soid, a simple interpretation, a hinted interpretation, a derived interpretation, and a secret or a mystical interpretation. There's different levels. And when you study, for example, a pasuk in Chumash, and by the same token in my Mechazal, you can study it on the simple level, on the higher level, on the higher level, on the higher level. And it's quite an exercise to study Torah on a variety of different levels, and to understand this interpretation, this interpretation, this interpretation. It's an even more exciting exercise, where after you study Torah on a variety of different levels, you create unity between them. Try to find unity in them. I'll tell you this, that for a few years I had a Parsha class where this was the whole design. We would do a pasuk in a variety of different interpretations, beginning with Rashi, all the way to Hasidus. And as long as I had an audience, I enjoyed those classes very much. But we also, in some cases, we had mazel. You would study something and see not just various interpretations, but the unity between the various interpretations. How they all really are in various different ways saying the same thing. And when one successfully paints this picture with all these dimensions, first you identify each interpretation separately, and then find the dependency of the lower interpretation and the higher interpretation, and weave it all together into a fabric, you extract, you delight in a beautiful unity, a beautiful picture within the Torah itself. The key component to this process is questions. In other words, what is the difference between learning Torah on a simple level and on a hint level, on a derived level, and a mystical level? Obviously, there's differences in the ideas and in the interpretations. But the key difference between one level and a second level and a third level and a fourth level is what constitutes a question. In Jewish theory, in Jewish Torah thought, and I suppose this is not just Torah thought, this is true across the board, a question is by itself an answer. A question is a key that unlocks a door that opens up a palace. Or like the Maimed HaChocham, Shailas Chocham Chatzei Tshuva, an intelligent question is half an answer. And there are many cases, I can show you examples, especially in Rambam, where Rambam only asks questions and tells you up front, I'm not going to give you any answers, I'm going to simply make the observations. My questions, my observations, these are the answers. Use this information to develop the ideas that he wishes to teach. And in Torah this is especially true. What separates, for example, Rashi from the Balaturim, who writes Remez, from the Yalshich, who writes Drush, from the Arizal, who writes Soid, is not so much the interpretations, but what is considered a question. On a lower level of Torah, certain things don't bother us. Who cares? So the Torah repeats itself twice, who does it bother? On a higher level of Torah, a non-question becomes a question. So if a person studies the Torah on level A, and graduates it, completes it, makes it beautiful, then he says, okay, now I'm going to ask questions that until now I wasn't entitled to ask, because on the Pshat level they were non-questions, but as I ascend from Pshat to Remez, I have a new dimension for questioning, a new possibility for questioning. And this is the richness and the profundity and in a way the infinity of the Torah. As you go higher and higher, you're asking more and more theoretical questions. But because it's Torah, in other words, because it's God's wisdom, notwithstanding that it's been revealed by man and struggled with by man and so forth and so on, it never disappoints you. You can always find new doors, new insights. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. In other words, the journey through Torah from level to level, and in general the journey of studying Torah, is questions. When you open up the scripture, you open up Torah Shabbat, you open up the Chumash, it's a closed book. When you look at it for face value, it's also simple, and none of it makes any sense at all. You begin to crack the mystery, the secret, the seal of Torah Shabbat when you begin asking questions. Why is this written this way? Why is this repeated twice? Why is this detail deleted? Why is this detail emphasized? Why is this story important, the other story unimportant? Questions are the doors or the keys to the doors that open us up to the infinity of the Torah, and it goes on and on and on, higher and higher and higher still. Accordingly, there's an interesting Talmudic allusion. There's a Gemara that says, I just want to make it clear, this Gemara that I'm about to quote is not said in this context. I'm applying it to this context because it belongs to this context, though the Gemara is speaking about something different. The Talmud makes a statement, which is true, undeniably true, and Kabbalah employs or exploits this idea in several contexts. And that statement is, Bereisha chashecha v'hoda nehera. First there is darkness and then there is light. It's a Gemara. First there is darkness and then there is light. First there is night and then there is day. If you don't have darkness, if you don't have questions, you will have no light, you will have no answers, you will have no insight, you will have no learning. If a person reads Mikra, a person reads Teresh B'Ksav, the Bible, the Chumash, for face value, and doesn't question it, It's also simple and so easy, but in addition to being simple and easy, it's also what we would call in some cultures simplistic, shallow, superficial. It's only when you force yourself to ask questions, and of course nobody likes to ask questions, because asking questions is conceding and admitting that we do not know. But when one asks questions, the journey of delving into the mystery and the secret and the infinity of the Torah begins. And when you master one dimension, you move on to a second dimension, and a second dimension, you move on to a third dimension, and so forth. First there is dark, and then there is light. First there is darkness, and then there is light. First there is night, and then there is day. The metaphor of this, before this, is the black letters of the Sefer Torah. The black letters of the Sefer Torah are covering over the white of the Sefer Torah. The white represents the light. If you have a Sefer Torah with no letters, just one big parchment, it's very bright. And what does it say to us? Absolutely nothing. So there are letters juxtaposed on that cloth, on that parchment. Or mystically speaking, they're not juxtaposed on the parchment, but they're extracted from the parchment. In the Lashon of Rashi, from the white fire, which is the higher level, emerges the black fire, which is the lower level, the individual letters. And when you look at the letters obstruct. They don't allow you to see the light. And you have to deal with the challenge the letters provide. Words are tools of communication. But communication is by definition inexact. So the words that reveal also conceal. They also hide. And when you're struggling with the words, you get to see the light. Not only the black light, but the white light. Not only the obvious light, but the light which is transcendent and beyond, that you would never access if you didn't go through the journey of having a question and an answer, having a darkness and then light. So if you wanted to understand, at least in part, the struggle of the great sages of yesteryear and of today and of tomorrow, that's what they're doing. They're studying Torah. They're analyzing words in Mikra and even words in Mishnah and Gemara and so forth and so on. And asking, what do the words mean? What is the blackness hiding so that eventually I should be able to discover it? What is the blackness concealing to force me to uncover that concealment and reach the light? And that's the process of the study of Torah, questions and answers. This is true throughout. On every level of Torah, this is how the Torah operates. It's a closed book. It's a great mystery. And there are various layers of Torah, and theoretically it's ad infinitum. And what the various layers of the Torah are doing is hiding the light from us as a provocation, as a stimulus to get us to challenge that concealment and eventually come to see not only the black light, but the white light itself. In other words, say it in simple English, studying Torah is asking questions, intelligent questions, and learning how to ask a question. And also learning the difference between an intelligent question and a foolish question, a relevant question and an irrelevant question, a question which is in context and a question which is out of context, which if you were a teenager, you would have a special skill at never getting right. It's a rite of passage, I reckon. Yeah, I don't know, I'm not a teenager, I don't know why I'm still dealing with those questions. Maybe I still am, which I guess is not so bad. Biologically, it certainly is advantageous. Now, Rabbi say there's an exception to this rule. And the exception to this rule is Kabbalah. Or to say it in the most ideal of terms, the exception to this rule is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's brought in Sfarim, it's brought in Chassidus also. Rabbi Shimon had a teacher, his name was Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva had a variety of students. Rabbi Shimon was only one of them. There was Rabbi Meir, and there was Rabbi Yossi, and there was Rabbi Yehuda. And there was Rabbi Lazar. The other disciples of Rabbi Akiva, as great as they were, followed the aforementioned design of first it is dark and then it is light. First we have questions and then we have answers. The Gemara says about, the Chazal say about Rabbi Meir actually. B'teirasei shal Rabbi Meir hayakasuv kosnei seir b'yalef. B'torato shal Rabbi Meir hayakatuv katnot or b'alef. The Torah tells us that when Adam and Eve were living in the Garden of Eden yet, God Almighty made them an outfit, a tunic. According to some opinions, it was actually a hairy attachment to their body, whether it was scales or it was fur, but it was actually physically attached to them. And the biblical reference is kosnei, which means a tunic. Oir means of leather, of animal skin.
They took it on,
By
or
Albish.
it was something that they wore.
According to a variety of Shitzanashi, it was like a skin. They couldn't take it off.
Mm.
And the spelling is oir, ayin vav reish, which means leather, skin. In the Torah of Rabbi Meir, it was written kosnes oir ba'alef. It was a tunic of light with an aleph. So of course this is exploited by the Mekubalim thoroughly. And the point that is made is that every garment conceals like leather covers. Kabbalistically, the garment of leather is the most dense. That's why we wear leather shoes. And Kabbalists wouldn't even wear leather belts. Leather goes on the feet. Silk goes on the head. And in between there's other things. Leather is considered the densest garment. Rabbi Meir's Torah, the garment was light. Oite oir kasalma. Light can also be a garment. In other words, Rabbi Meir had such an illuminated Torah, such a lofty Torah, that he didn't have darkness and then light, he simply had light. The person who personified this, who represented this most completely on the highest level was Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, because he was the father of Kabbalah, the writer of the Zohar, and so forth and so on. He didn't have questions, only answers. He studied the Torah, he read a word, and said, it means this. It means this. It's not, what does it mean? I don't understand. I have a question. It means this. Perhaps for me and for you, it becomes necessary to say, now what would have been the question had he asked the question? But in the world of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, there were no questions. Because his black letters were not leather, they were light. His black letters didn't conceal the light, they were a light unto themselves. And this is, I think, a very interesting and alternative way of explaining to you in ideal terms, not in practical terms, but in philosophical terms, in mystical terms, what's the difference between Kabbalah and the lower levels of the Torah? When we study Kabbalah, all we are is more confused, that's all. People who are true Kabbalists, it's not that they're smarter than us and they know the sweetest, how to say them backwards. It's that they're sensitive. They're tuning into light. The truest Kabbalists, what the Pardes calls Oskim b'Kabbalah, people expert at Kabbalah, they don't have darkness. There's no Bereishach HaShecha v'Hoda Neheda, there's no darkness, and then light, there's light. And this Rabbi has been the topic we've been learning about in this Iggeres Hakodesh. This is class 3 on letter 26. We've been studying Torah. What is Torah? And we've divided the Torah into Eitz Hadas, Tevara, and Eitz HaChayim. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. And we've made a very, very important argument. And the argument is, every level of Torah is sacred. Even the simplest words in the simplest passage, in the most basic insight in the Torah, is the divine wisdom and the divine will, and it's absolutely perfect and Ein Sof and so forth. The difference between the higher Torah and the lower Torah is not in the Torah. Eitz Hadas, Tevara, studying halacha or pshat is as divine as studying Kabbalah. The difference is, first of all, in us, in our consumption of it. When you study Kabbalah, you're relating something in a pure and more ideal and a more godly level. While when you're studying halacha or pshat, you're dealing with the same Torah in a much more elementary way. And there's another difference. And it is this other difference which is truly the issue of this letter. And that is that in Kabbalah there is a concept called birurim. Birur. People frequently translate the word birur as elevating sparks. It's simply not the correct translation. The Hebrew for elevating sparks is aliyah. Birur means to create clarity. Why do you need to create clarity? Because things are entangled. For example, you've got a pile of nuts, and in those nuts you've got all kinds of peels and shells and other kinds of residue and waste. Boirer is to disentangle, to put the good on the right and the bad on the left. And of course on Shabbos and Shabbat you're not allowed to do boirer. In God's creation there is a ta'aruvus, there's an entanglement of good and evil, as we discussed at length, I think 2 classes ago. The design of creation after Adam and Eve made the choice to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is that they wouldn't simply know good and evil academically, they would know good and evil intimately, or alternatively, they wouldn't know good and evil, they would be good and evil. This was the choice they made. And since that moment, we've been involved in disentangling, in separating the confusion, the entanglement, the mix, the cholent, the Russians call it the vinaigrette of good and evil, birur, boirer. What's unusual about this letter is that it discusses the boirer of Torah. How when one studies Torah, they create clarity in the world. In convention, what creates boirer, what separates good from evil? Involvement in physical things. When you take a physical thing and you do a mitzvah, or you take physical money and you give tzedakah, or if you have a business, or you have a job, or whatever kind of a vocation you have, and you behave in your place of work according to the halachas of Torah appropriately, and you give tzedakah, and you serve Hashem, you are creating, you're elevating, you are creating clarity in physical things, and you're bringing them closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. On a higher level, we can attribute boirer to tefillah. Prayer is much more fine than business and being out there in the world, because prayer you don't do in your car or on the field. Prayer you do in shul. But even prayer is a struggle, as the Zayah says, Shas Sleisa, Shas Krava. The time of prayer is time for battle. And we always saw Torah as Oseh Shalom B'Mirama. Right? Torah is peace. Like I tell Hashem, Hashem Torah is peace. Well, in this letter, we're discovering that there's something called the birur of Torah. How when one studies Torah, in addition to all the other wonderful things achieved, they're creating clarity in God's world. But there's a difference. If one studies Kabbalah, and again, when you and I study Kabbalah, the biggest miracle that happened is that we won't understand it and we'll admit it. That'll be the greatest accomplishment. Okay? But someone who's truly tuned in, studies Kabbalah, Kabbalah is a Torah of light. And it's called, for the mystics in the room, Or Atzmi, a light that is connected to the essence. Its sources, Chochmah and its higher sources, Pnimius HaChochmah and its higher sources, Gevuras Abatika Kadisha, called Tala de Bedulcha, and I can tell you a few fancier words so you'll think I'm a cool guy, but it's not impressive, it's just language. It's written in Aramaic. To you. It's Aramaic, it's not going to make a difference. But it's a koyach atzmi, it's a powerful, it's a very deep, it's not a high source, but a deep source. And the nature of this kind of learning is that it automatically clarifies. It's like you shine a light, and all the junk goes to the left, and all the junk goes to the right. You don't have to engage. There's no hitlapshut. You don't have to come into the struggle of good and evil. When a person has a Torah, like Rabbi had, Kosna Seder B'Yalef, where the Torah, the black of the Torah is also light. So the light doesn't engage, doesn't delve and struggle and try to resolve conflict and entanglement. It shines light and things are automatically resolved.
Like the splitting of the sea, maybe.
Well, God did that. Yeah. No rabbi did that. Yeah. But when one studies Torah on all the other levels, Torah also is a birur. Torah creates a clarity. We'll talk about this later in Mitzvah. Which means, say, when a person sits in a Beis HaMedrash and studies a piece of Gemara or a halacha, or whatever the case is, and he struggles to understand it, he asks questions and questions and questions, and then he looks for answers, and with the help of the grace of God, he finds answers. Besides for the fact that he's doing a mitzvah, studying Torah, besides for the fact that he feels like $1 million, besides for the fact that he's being Hakodesh, Kedusha, Torah, is innovating new ideas in Torah, somehow that engagement in Torah creates a clarity in the world, though he is not directly involved. He's sitting in Beis Medrash, sitting in the yeshiva, he's studying Torah, the birurim, the clarity happens in the world, by the study of Torah alone. But this study of Torah is itself a birur. It's itself a struggle, I need to clarify. And what lies at the heart of it is questions. I don't understand. This is what's bothering me. This is a disturbance to me. It doesn't make sense. Why is it written this way? Why does he insist on saying it the other way? And on and on and on. And questions, if they're only shalos chacham, after the questions of a wise man or a person, they are themselves half answers, at least. So the Zohar that our letter begins with makes a statement amongst many statements that one of the differences between Kabbalah and all the other levels of Torah, that in Kabbalah there are no questions. The meaning of this statement isn't only that Kabbalah has no questions. It means that the entire level of Torah associated with Kabbalah is light. All other levels of Torah are also light, but they are a light that must engage, which is called in Hasidic culture hitlapshut. You want to fix something, you got to go where the broken pipe is. When you study Torah, albeit you're in a Beis HaMedrash, but if you want to understand the resolution to this issue, you have to get into the head of a liar and a cheat and a deceiver and a manipulator. Think like he thinks. And only then can you come up with the correct insight and the correct halacha and the correct resolution and so forth and so on. So this Tanya has been teaching us that we have these two dimensions of Torah. In as much as they are Torah, they're equal. The one studies Torah is connected to the tree of life is true if you're studying Chumash with Rashi or Chumash without Rashi, or a law in Kitzah Shulchan Aruch, the abbreviated Shulchan Aruch, makes no difference. But in terms of the idea that in addition to all the other things, Torah has a birur effect, Torah has an aspect of bringing clarity into the world, Kabbalah shines light and everything falls into place by itself. The taruvis, the entanglement, is self-resolved, while all other levels of Torah ask questions and give answers, and consequently, the birur of the Torah on the more nigla levels is struggling with the entanglement, like any yeshiva bacha does, like any Rosh Yeshiva does, like the greatest of sages have done since the beginning of time. In Kisvei Arizal, it's brought, the V'chaim Vital, right, the Kisvei Arizal, that his mighty, my master, the Arizal, was an incredible mind, an extraordinary mind. He says, every idea that he studied, he would give 6 different interpretations for, in halacha, in nigla. And he would perspire, he would sweat profusely. When he finished an exercise and learning, he was dripping from sweat. And then he would give one Kabbalistic interpretation. And as he did it, he would dry. Because there was no struggle in his Kabbalah. It was beautiful, it was peaceful. And he wouldn't stop the Kabbalistic commentary until he was completely dry, so that none of his perspiration should be wasted, because that could have been given chayas teklipa to the other side. So the meaning of this insight is, it reveals the struggle of Torah. The struggle of Torah is about the level of the Torah. Certain levels of Torah are designed by derech shayla tshuva. You have to first not know and then know. You first have a kasha and a teretz. Kabbalah is Torah oir, it's a Torah of light. And in the language of this Iggeres Hakodesh, this is the difference between Eitz HaChayim and Eitz HaDas, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And amongst other things, we touched on the idea that nowadays, that means until Mashiach comes, the most important exercise is the study of Nigla, Halacha, not Kabbalah. When Mashiach comes, the issue will be primarily Kabbalah. But at the moment, the exercise has to be primarily Halacha, because so long as we live in a world of entanglement, we must deal with a Torah that addresses the entanglement and attempts to disentangle it. In other words, just like in our behavioral lives, there's a struggle to do the right thing and not to do the wrong thing, to be pure and holy and removed and not animalistic and indulgent and lustful. And when we're doing this, we're not just refining ourselves, we're elevating the world, because the world is entangled. We have to disentangle it. The same is true in our Torah study. When we study Torah, we're affecting the world. Once Mashiach comes, the world will be in a state of clarity, and the Torah will be in a state of clarity. And then the priority will be to study Kabbalah, as I'm going to explain later on. So he says, nowadays we must engage. And of course, just as we engage in behavior, for example, if I eat food, if it's kosher and I eat it properly, I'm elevating it. If I eat food which is not kosher, I cannot elevate it and it drags me down. If I eat non-kosher food, it's not good. But if I eat non-kosher food in a situation where the non-kosher has been made kosher, for example, if my life depends on it, say for example a person needs a medicine, and the medicine isn't kosher, but the person's life needs to be saved, at that point it becomes a mitzvah to eat not non-kosher. So then what was yesterday klipa treif is now nasa heter gomer, it becomes permitted, it becomes elevated. So this is the exercise that we do in our lives. Says Rabbi, the same exercise we do in our learning. But there's another idea. And what's the other idea? The other idea is Shabbos, or Shabbat. Shabbos, it says, Perish Chagechem v'le Perish Shabbatchem. Beidei Asur. On Shabbos, everything is godliness. As long as it's kosher, it becomes a mitzvah. On Shabbos, we say eating is a mitzvah, and sleeping is a mitzvah, and all other physical things are mitzvahs, because it's a holy day. And as such, it's not a struggle to be as we should and to disentangle the entangled world of Hashem. It happens by itself. Just like in Eitz HaChaim, in the tree of life, it has a deep Atzmius Dekaoy, a very powerful light which creates the clarity simply by shining. Shabbos, food is holy. Shabbos, clothing are holy. That's why in Shabbos, mitzvah la'anga, Shabbos you're supposed to beautify and you're supposed to delight in physical things. This is not just a permission, it's actually a mitzvah. Because Shabbos you find yourselves in a different situation. But for the most part, in other words, you want to judge our lives on balance. In what are we involved? We are involved in what's called Eitz Hadas Teva Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, to try and disentangle the entanglement. And the Alter Rebbe introduces us to another language. And the other language is the language of the Talmud Chacham and the Am Ha'aretz. The scholar versus the ignorant person. This language is the language used in the Zohar. But I want to make it very clear that the average person whom we call a Talmud Chacham is in this context an Am Ha'aretz. Because the word Talmud Chacham here means a person whose life is lived on a level of Chacham. Not just a scholar who knows much, but a person whose identity is defined by his wisdom. And as a consequence, we're talking about a human being who basically lives in the world of Eitz HaChaim. A person lives on the level of the tree of life. In other words, in the language of the Zohar, Talmud Chacham and Am Ha'aretz doesn't mean a learned person versus an ignorant person. It means a already been birud, ABB, already been corrected, already been clarified, and been given streamlining and so forth, versus a person who's in the midst, who's in the process of creating clarity within themselves. In other words, Talmidei Chachamim are not a dime a dozen. But they exist here and there. Periodically we meet people. The Eibishter puts people into this world who are on such a lofty level. It's not just they understand the Torah better and they're elevating the food better. They're beyond the struggle. They live in a world of peace. They live in a messianic world. Rabbi Hillel Paracher quoted the Alter Rebbe here from the Isaac Homer that there are certain tzaddikim for whom the Beis HaMikdash was never destroyed. And the example that he gave was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Shimon Bar Yochai's life was miserable. Spent 13 years in a cave, he didn't even have matzah. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's world, the Beis HaMikdash, was never destroyed. He was tuned into the light. This is the concept of a Talmud Chacham. A person by whom it is illuminated. By whom it is lichtig. A person for whom it's simple, clear. I'll tell you a nice story. I remember telling you the story when I first started the tiny classes. So it's sort of going for a circle in a way. We're far from done, but still. The Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, was about 25 years old. And he sent a letter to an old chassid, who was probably twice his age, by the name of Chaim Ber Vilensky, from the city of Kremenchuk, asking him to help him understand a certain very difficult Maimer in Hasidus, in the Imre Bina, from the middle Rebbe. The chassid gets the letter. He thinks to himself, I'm old and he's young, but he's the Rebbe and I'm the chassid. He doesn't need my help and I'm not going to answer. He felt it was inappropriate. I should help the Rebbe. The Kremenchuga Rav was a chassid by the name of Paltiel Defalovich. He was a great scholar, very big scholar, and a young, tough guy. He visits Lubavitch and he goes into the Rebbe Rashab. He was older than him also. He says to Rebbe Rashab, Rebbe Rashab tells him, I sent a letter to Chaim Ber. He didn't answer me. I'm surprised. I don't know. He angry at me. He grudge. Naturally, when Yitzchak Rafalovich came home, before he even went into his own home, he ran to Reb Chaim Ber, his friend Reb Chaim Ber's house, and he slammed open the door, and he started to give it to him. The Rebbe writes you a letter and doesn't answer. Reb Chaim Ber stood there and listened very patiently. Every word was soothing and was a blessing to him. And when he finished tearing him to pieces, he says, by the way, did the Rebbe tell you what the letter was about? The letter that I didn't answer? He says, no. He says, he asked me I should help him understand the Maimer. I think he'll do fine. He'll do just fine without my help. And the Yitzchak Rafalovich felt like a defeated animal. He put his tail between his legs and he crept. He was right. Somehow this comment reached the Rebbe Rashab. reached the young Rebbe who had made the request. Months later, this same Chassid of Chaim Ber visited Lubavitch. And as was the tradition of real Chabad Hasidim, he stood in the Cheder Sheni, in the Chabad Naseh, in the second room, and davened, meditation at length. The young Lubavitch Rebbe, when he was walking out of the shul, instead of going home, went into the second room where he was davening, and stood and he watched him for a long time, watched him meditate. And then he said, I don't know to whom he said it, maybe he said it himself, but the quote has reached us. He said, is gerecht. Ich hab sich gekannt einkennen an ihm. Ich gewollt aber wissen, Zido mit Seichel allein kann man durchtan. Which means he's right, I didn't need his help. I simply wanted to know if it was intellectually possible to understand this, or it could only be understood by somebody who has Ruach HaKodesh. In other words, the Rebbe Rashab had a problem. He learned the Maimon Chasidus, and he found it so abstract, he wasn't sure if he understood it intellectually, or he actually felt it because he was a spiritual person. So he asked the person who he knew wasn't a spiritual person, who could only understand it if it was intellectual. So he sends him a letter and says, tell me, you understand it? Because if you understand it, then I know I understand it. Because if you don't understand it, perhaps I don't understand it, I can simply see it. And then he finished and he said, he says, by watching him daven, I determined, yep, the human mind can understand this. It's a wonderful story. It's an incredible story. It's a very meaningful story. It's a very rich story. And this is Eitz Hadas and Eitz HaChaim. Eitz Hadas is Torah. Torah is done in a shul, not on a street. But it struggles with the good and the evil. It struggles to understand it, to give it order. And it has an effect on the world. A Yid sits and studies Torah in the Beis HaMedrash, the world becomes a better place. Eitz HaChaim is Oir, lichtig. It's light. It shines a light, and it doesn't deal with the struggle at all. So there are Talmidei Chachamim, there are individual people, rare people, holy people, like this story with the Rebbe Nishma who have Torah, Oir, illuminated Torah, and then the rest of us, even the biggest scholars. If we're not in the light, if we're not been given this gift of Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, we're called Am Ha'aretz. Not in our ignorance, but on our connection to earthiness, to the world, to Artziut. And the Rebbe employs another expression, which is quite unsettling, to be candid. But this is really how Kabbalah sees these things. In other words, I'm going to tell you something you've heard about, but I'm going to give you a very novel interpretation of it. In the Chumash, we read about a group of people called Erev Rav. Erev Rav. Remember them? The Torah accounts, Torah relates, when the Jewish people left Egypt, so they left 600,000 men, women, and children. And V'gam Erev Rav Ola Itam. And the literal translation of the word Erev Rav means a large entanglement of multitudes. All kinds of races and nationalities and groups joined the Jews on the departure from Egypt, and they wanted to become members of the Jewish nation. Erev Rav, a big mishmash of people. Kabbalah says Erev Rav doesn't mean a lot of mixed up, a lot of people from other languages and races and cultures. It means Jews who are still entangled and not yet disentangled. In other words, according to Kabbalah, Erev Rav and Am Ha'aretz are synonyms. A person whose life is a struggle, and correspondingly his Torah study is a struggle, is Erev Rav. Erev Rav means that within him there is still an entanglement, there's still a ta'aruvot, there's a mixture, there's a big mishmash of Tev and Ra, as opposed to the Talmud Chacham. And the Talmud Chacham doesn't simply mean the scholar, it means the tuned-in Jew, the very, very sensitive, enlightened person who, because of the Ruach HaKodesh, doesn't have questions and give answers, he has clarity. There aren't a lot of such people, but there are some such people. So it says in Zohar an interesting thing, that until Mashiach comes, Talmidei Chachamim eat from Erev Rav, from Amei Ha'aretz. Until Mashiach comes, these rabbis, who live in a world of absolute clarity, get their nourishment, get their life from people who are in a state of entanglement. Now, practically what this means is rabbis are broke. They have no time. They're busy studying Torah and have to be supported. But the Alter Rebbe makes an observation that there are plenty of rabbis who are very rich. The Gemara says about two rabbis that they disqualify any excuse against the study of Torah. Rabbi Elazar ben Chasma and Hillel HaNasi. Hillel was so poor, it's indescribable, and yet he studied Torah, so nobody can say I'm too poor to study. And Elazar ben Chasma was literally filthy rich, indescribably wealthy. And he was also a Talmud Chacham who devoted his days, so you cannot say, well, I have no time to study Torah, I'm a millionaire. He was a multi-billionaire. So everybody is within the framework. In other words, these two rabbis have made us all uncomfortable. What does it mean that nowadays, Talmidei Chachamim, that rabbis and scholars get their nourishment from Eid Rab? The world is an entanglement of good and evil. And therefore, although these great rabbis may in their own personal lives experience a clarity, their role in this world is to study Nigle. Is to spend most of their time studying the revealed Torah, Halacha, and Pshat, and so forth, and only a small portion of their time studying Kabbalah, because since the world we live in is an entanglement of good and evil, they must engage in the struggle of disentangling it in as much as Torah is concerned. So therefore, even if there's a person who in his or her own personal life is on a level of Eitz HaChai, their Torah is illuminated, lichtik, there's no darkness, there are no questions, there are only answers. They are told that until Mashiach comes, their primary preoccupation must be to engage in Eitz Hadas, Toivara, studying Torah, on the level where Toivara, good and evil, are entangled, to contribute, to assist, to help, to say it in simple English, in bringing Mashiach. In ending the entanglement that God Almighty created in His world, and disentangling it. And this is the meaning of the Zohar. It doesn't mean that rabbis need poor people, rich people to support them. It means that too, but that's not what the Zohar is talking about. That's what the Halacha is talking about. The Zohar is saying that even though they personally may be on a level of Eitz HaChayim, since the world in which they live is in a level of Eitz HaDas, they must go away from Eitz HaChayim, delve into the level of Eitz HaDas. In other words, even if a person has Torah with not questions, they must step down from the level of Torah with no questions to a lower level of Torah where they must ask questions and struggle with these questions and try and find answers. Because this is how the effect a bidur, a clarity, a correction into the Eibishter's world. And I'll share something very interesting with you. At least I think it's interesting. And that is, way back in Tanya, this is letter 27. In letter 11, which was probably 11 months ago. It's been a long time since we did letter 11. It's been a long time back. The Alter Rebbe talked about faith. Emunah. And emunah taheda b'yetza b'reishis, complete, comprehensive belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God Almighty, is to believe that ein ra yedid milmayla. No evil comes from on high. Everything that comes to us comes from God's chokhmah, as he calls it, God's wisdom. God's wisdom is the ultimate kindness. And if it's a divine plan that a person should go through some kind of a difficulty, a person should not even say, I accept the suffering with love. A person should say, if this is what God wants for me, then this is the act of God's kindness. And the Alter Rebbe said there, and don't be from Eidev Rav. Who are Eidev Rav? Eidev Rav are people who look at their lives and say, hey, something rotten is going on. Something no good is happening. It feels no good, it looks no good, it sounds no good, then it is no good. And Torah said, how can it be no good? It's the Eibishter's world. So Eidev Rav means us. It means simple people. Eidev Rav doesn't mean them. In other words, in Torah, in Chumash, Eidev Rav is a bunch of non-Jews who joined into the early creation, the birth of the Jewish nation. But in Kabbalah, Eidev Rav means Jews who are still entangled. People, which is the vast majority of us, of course, for whom good and evil are still confused. We're struggling with good and evil, and one of the symptoms of it is a lack of faith, or a challenge of faith. And when things don't work out, we start wondering where God is. While people who are Talmidei Chachamim, not from the Eidev Rav, and have this kind of clarity, there cannot be such a lack of faith. And the Tanya says, the Zohar is saying in this letter, that even Talmidei Chachamim, even if you're one of those people who are your personal identity, are above Eitz Hadas Tevera. You find yourself on a level of Eitz HaChayim. In your world, everything is clear. You must go down from Eitz HaChayim to engage in Eitz Hadas Tevera. That's your panosa. That's your livelihood. What does that mean? It's a livelihood. This is what you're going to eat for breakfast. It means this is why you were born. Just like this panosa gashmis, physical sustenance. You don't eat breakfast, you're going to be hungry. The spiritual sustenance. The spiritual sustenance is the justification for our existence. And although God plants such holy people with divine inspiration in this world of Tevarah, their parnasa, what feeds them, is not their study in Kabbalah. Their parnasa is to step away from the study of Kabbalah and to engage in the study of Nigla to affect the Bidur of Tevarah. And this is called that Talmidei Chachamim being misparnes meyamei ha'aretz. This is called that scholars and rabbis are being sustained by ordinary people. This means to say people whose real personal level is Eitz HaChaim. Since the world is in a level of Eitz HaDas, they must descend to the level of Eitz HaDas, study Torah on that level. In other words, when people study Torah, why? The obvious reason to study Torah is to know what to do. People study Torah because there's a mitzvah to complete. There's a special chiyuv to learn Kol HaTorah Kula B'Pardes. It says in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, it says in Halacha that if you don't study the whole Torah, you have to come back in another Gilgul to finish the Torah. There's also Torah, Yagdal Torah V'Yada. You learn Torah to make the Torah beautiful. There's also Torah Lishma. You're learning Torah to make the Torah higher, closer to the Yebishter. And here we're discovering that there's a Torah of Bidur. That you're learning Torah to disentangle entanglement. And Alter Rebbe says, and the Kabbalah of this is as follows. And we talked about this last week. There are questions in Torah that have never happened. There are issues in Halacha that are discussed in Talmud, especially the boys of Rabbi Yirmiyah, who's a great sage. My son happens to be learning Yilimitit. I have a 9-year-old who was learning Aschol's Gemara. Just started 2 weeks ago. So you start off the first piece, Peres Mefuzorim, Kav Arba Amas, and you have boy Rabbi Yirmiyah. So I told my kid, I was learning with him on Friday night, I said to him, this is Rabbi Rabbi Yirmiyah, you're going to get used to him. He's always going to ask you the questions that are going to get under your skin. Because he's asking all the who cares questions. Like all these little tedious... The Gemara tells a story. He once asked a question in yeshiva, and they kicked him out. Enough of these questions. All of his hypothetical... He's famous. He's notorious for his... what do you want kind of questions, you know? But Rabbi Yirmiyah is right. Besides for the Yagdal Torah V'Yada, you're supposed to study Torah and Torah V'Lilma, then it's not all the rest. There's another idea. And the other idea is, in God's creation, there's all kind of entanglement. Taruvas Tevarah, that's traced back to the original sin of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Not only here, in the spiritual realms as well. But in the spiritual realms, there's no workers. You can't do any fixing. A neshama in Gan Eden just basks in the glory of God. There's no possibility to do anything. All the struggles happen here. When people study Torah, thank you very much. When people study Torah and struggle with the Torah and are mevarer the Torah, great clarity in the Torah through those struggles, they're not only disentangling entanglements in this world, they're disentangling entanglements that are happening on the spiritual levels. In the higher worlds, in the more spiritual, lofty worlds, there are all kinds of entanglements that a person is correcting through their studying Torah. In other words, you never have any idea what is accomplished when you're learning Torah. Because the learning Torah has many ripples, besides what you're doing and what you're enjoying and what you're being humbled by or you're humble in. You have no idea. The higher worlds achieve clarity when a Jew down here studies Torah. And this is what the Chazal tell us, that the Shamas and Gan Eden and the angels come to listen to a Jew study Torah. Exactly, what are they interested in? They're 1,000 times as intelligent, they don't need our Torah. And the answer is they're witnessing how through our learning Torah, through our Parnasa, through the Talmud Chacham, as he's called in this Iggeres Hakodesh, in the Zohar, through the Yid who's by himself on level Eitz HaChaim, descending from that level, and engaging Dafke Nigla the Torah. And the part of the Torah which is Choshech and then Oyer, questions and then answers. It's not only that he's revealing new commentary in Torah, he's disentangling entanglements, which is a necessary requirement for the coming of Mashiach. Before Mashiach comes, all the entanglement, all the Nitzutzi Kedusha that are entangled need to be disentangled. And therefore, a lot of things fall into place. There's nothing wrong with Nigla. It's not like Nigla the Torah is like half holy. It's just as holy as Nista. It is only that it descends to a level of struggle. Moreover, this is the Parnasa, this is the priority, this is what we're here for now. The Kabbalah is parparois. The Kabbalah we study is a taste, is a flavor, is an anticipation, it's setting the stage for the times of Mashiach, and so forth and so on. And then when a Jew studies Torah and struggles, that study affects Bidur, affects the clarity in the Rebishter's world. What happens? Wait. And So every time you study a halacha, and you invent a new halacha, even though it's completely irrelevant practically, you've released another spark. You've just redeemed another aspect of divinity, which was part of the master plan, that became entangled with the original sin, and you're putting it back to its appropriate place. And the Rebbe teaches Pada B'Shalom. Bashkacha Pratis this week is Yitas Kislev, the Chag HaGula, the Alter Rebbe, whose Sefer we're learning. And of course, the psalm, which is so associated with this day, is Pada B'Shalom Nafshi, my soul was redeemed in peace. And the Gemara says, the Talmud says, what is the meaning of this pasuk? Pada B'Shalom Nafshi Mikrovli, I was redeemed in peace. Says the Gemara, Kol Ha'isek B'Teira, a person studies Teira, and there's more words. Mala Lav HaKosov Ki'ilu Poda'ani Li. A person studies Torah and other things, is redeeming God. God needs redemption. Where is he imprisoned? So in this Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says not God needs redemption. The sparks of godliness that have become entangled because of the original sin are redeemed when a Jew studies Torah. You're learning Torah in a shul and in some other realm, in some other world. This struggle has an unbelievably useful purpose and a great reward. It's an act of redemption. And this process of disentangling entanglements and prioritizing nigla the Torah, making the most important thing halacha and pshat, and as I called it in the beginning, the questions and then the answers, the darkness and then the light, is true only till Mashiach comes. But once Mashiach comes, that means that the task has been completed. All of the sparks have been disentangled. And once all of the sparks have been successfully disentangled, it becomes a brand new Torah. A Torah called Eitz HaChayim. And in the language of the Mekubalim, it's called the Torah of Yichudim. You're studying Torah not to disentangle entanglement, but to bring more godliness down into this world. Create new marriages, new unions on high, and to bring more godliness down. And it becomes a Torah of peace. And accordingly, the reasons for mitzvot, the reason for the commandments, the reason for the mitzvahs change. We hold, Rambam holds, Torah holds, the truth is, the mitzvahs never change. The same mitzvahs Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob undertook to keep, that we were commanded to do, that we're going to do after Mashiach comes, exactly the same mitzvahs. But the reasons change. The kavanah, the tam. Why do we do mitzvahs? There's so many reasons to do mitzvahs, beginning with developing better character and concluding with making unions in the higher realms. Now we do mitzvot significantly for the purposes of birur, to disentangle entanglements. Once Mashiach comes, we're doing mitzvahs strictly to bring down more light. And, don't misunderstand, says the Alter Rebbe, Mashiach comes, and we're going to be studying the same Torah, but on a level of oyer. Instead of the panosa being the priority of our learning Torah, is to go away from Eitz HaChaim to Eitz HaDas, to disentangle entanglements. Instead, we'll be involved in Yichudim, we'll be engaged in Eitz HaChaim. But that doesn't mean there won't be the revealed Torah. Doesn't mean there won't be halacha, or doesn't mean there won't be nigla. Why? Because Mashiach is still a world. Tchiyat HaMeitim, according to the Nachmanides, the Ramban, is not a world. You're in a physical body, but you don't eat, you don't sleep, and you're born, and you don't die. But Mashiach's coming doesn't end life as we know it. It just improves it. And after Mashiach comes, people are still born and people are still dying. Which means to say there's laws of Tumah, there's laws of Tahara, there's laws of burying the dead, there's laws of Shchita. He brings a whole list of things that after Mashiach comes are also going to be. You're not allowed to eat blood, you're not allowed to eat certain fats of animals, and so forth and so on. But when you have such clarity, he says, when you are tuned in to Eitz HaChayim, to the tree of life, he says one of two possibilities is true. The first possibility is that you simply never forget. So you study halacha, you study the whole nigla, all there is to know once, and it's permanently carved into your memory, and you can move on to bigger and better things. The Weltzach, the Misnagdim say that the Vilna Gaon finished studying nigla at the age of 18 years old. The man lived into his late 70s. The rest of his life he was studying Kabbalah. I find that so interesting. I believe it. But it just gives you an idea of what's been gone. It's gone. Mashiach is going to come, you're going to completely master nigla, and it will be effortless. It won't be hard to learn, you'll never forget it. So you'll know how to do shchita and tumah and tara and yeldas and the rest. You'll be busy with higher things, with yichudim. That's one level. He says, but there's an even higher level. This is a wonderful idea. The higher level is as follows. I want to ask you a question, says the Alter Rebbe. Avraham Avinu practiced Torah, yeah? You tell me where he picked that up? In Barnes and Nobles, you got it on Amazon. Where did he get the Torah from? On the internet, yeah? Where did he get the internet from, yeah? And the answer is, Avraham Avinu was tuned into Soid, to Kabbalah, to the higher Torah. But Avraham Avinu had such a clarity in Pnimiyas HaTorah that he extracted from the Nista the Nigla. He never learned halacha. He just knew it. His in-tuneness, the depth of his connectedness to the light of the higher dimension of Torah automatically provided for him clarity about the law. So on the first level, at least you need to learn it once. There won't be shikha, but you got to learn it. On the second level, you won't learn it in the first place. Because the nista will be so strong, so deep, so connecting, that you'll know the halacha from it. But then the Alter Rebbe says something very interesting. It's not so pleasant, but it's very enlightening. I think it's very, very interesting and helpful. And that is, he says, after Mashiach comes, there will continue being Eidev Rav. Eidev Rav, people who are still entangled. That means to say, if I understand it correctly, the Kabbalah says Mashiach cannot come until many things occur. One has to do with every soul being born. Another one has to do with every soul studying the whole Torah. Shalag al-Gulam discusses link. And another thing is that every spark needs to be elevated. But it's an endless, it's a bottomless pit. There's no end to sparks. Never finishes. So there is a certain master plan. There's a certain level of correction that must be attained before Mashiach comes, and then Mashiach comes, even if an individual in his own personal life still has things to correct. Says the Alter Rebbe, Mashiach comes. So the Talmidei Chachamim are home scot-free. Their parnasa is no longer from Am Ha'aretz. They no longer have to descend to study the Torah that disentangles entanglement, their Torah is Torah of light. But Eidev Rav, those people who go into Mashiach unworthy, undeserving, and are still involved in the struggle between good and evil, are going to continue struggling with good and evil after Mashiach comes. And for them especially, there will be a need to study Nigla. He says, because tzaddikim, mistakes don't happen, mistakes are not made, so they're going to shech, so it's going to be kosher, the chalaf is never going to have a pagam. And he goes through a series of examples like this. For inexact people, mistakes happen to people who sort of invite them. So we're going to have to study Nigla, we're going to have to struggle with Nigla, and we're going to be continuing to engage Eitz Hadas Tevara until each individual Am Ha'aretz, each individual member of the Eidev Rav will personally graduate to the Madrega that's called the Talmud Chacham. So the world of Mashiach is different than the world of now, because the priority is going to be Eitz HaChayim and not Eitz Hadas. But as individuals, just as now there are people who are holding at the level of Eitz HaChayim, though it's a world of panos, of Eitz Hadas, after Mashiach comes, though it's going to be a world of Eitz HaChayim, they're going to be individuals who will be holding a Madrega of Eitz Hadas Tevara. And on this basis, the Zohar resolves a wonderful Gemara. This is an example, this is one of a million examples, where Kabbalah takes an argument and says it isn't an argument, it's a perspective. One of the most famous arguments about Mashiach, which is so frequently quoted in the Rebbe's writings, and it's a Gemara in other places in Shas, it's a Rambam in other places in Rambam, is, will Mashiach come naturally, or will Mashiach come supernaturally? The Gemara brings, Ein b'nei al-mazeli meisa Mashiach el-shibud malchi yispulvad. Ein bein olam hazeli yemot ha-Mashiach ela shibud malachut bilvad. Which means, after Mashiach comes, it's olam k'minhagi noyeg. It's exactly the same world that we know now, except that we will be our own sovereign, we'll be independent. But there's another opinion. It says Mashiach comes and miracles occur on an incredible scale. So how do we understand this? There's two opinions. Two opinions means one is right, which means that the other is wrong, right? Well, the Zayah says they're both right. Mashiach comes for the Talmidei Chachamim on a level of great miracles, and for the Am Ha'aretz on a level of Teva. Mashiach comes to every Jew. But for the Talmid Chacham, for the person on the level of Eitz HaChayim, the miracles happen immediately because he's on a level of miracle. For the Am Ha'aretz, for the Eidev Rav, it will be true that in other words, it's not two opinions. It's two people. Mashiach comes for every Jew. And really, Mashiach comes for all of humanity, like we discussed in Sfarim. For those who are on the higher level, it's automatically great miracles. For those on the lower level, they're going to have to earn them. And have to earn them by being mavared, by disentangling the entanglement that they personally retain within themselves. And they're going to have to struggle with nigla, and struggle with tumah and tada, and struggle with this heter, and struggle with making mistakes. And when they'll achieve clarity, so to speak, Mashiach will come for them on a level of Eitz HaChayim. Mashiach will come for them on a level of miracles. So in other words, it's not two opinions in the Gemara, it's simply two realities of Mashiach. And you've got to admit that this letter is really, really wonderful.